Happy Wednesday, everyone. So, today we are going to be together looking at these passages, as you can see, on Martin Luther King and Ruby Bridges. So, what I want to do first is I'm actually going to show you the questions that we're going to be answering together, and then we're going to read the passage. This is just so, as we read, we can kind of know what we're looking for as we read. So I'm going to scroll down to our questions. Okay, so we have question 1, what's similar about when Martin Luther King Jr. and Ruby Bridges was born? And then we have when or was Martin Luther King Jr. and Ruby Bridges' involvement in the civil rights movement the same or different? And then we have, did people react similarly with Martin Luther King Jr.'s and Ruby Bridges' involvement in the civil rights movement? Okay, so we're going to be looking for these three things as we read both of our passages. So let's start with Martin Luther King Jr. Okay, so Martin Luther King Jr. was born during the time of segregation. I'm actually going to highlight that. I think that might be important. This means that whites and African Americans were separated. They had their own schools, shops, and even bathrooms. He went to a segregated school in Georgia. He was always a strong believer of civil rights, which was a movement to get whites and African Americans equal treatment. He believed in nonviolent demonstrations. He didn't think you should have to hurt people to get what you want. He gave speeches urging people to change the segregation laws. He was even a part of the Montgomery bus boycott that was started by Rosa Parks. Martin's family was threatened and harassed because of his involvement in the civil rights movement. Martin will always be remembered for the major role he played in the civil rights movement. So I'm going to highlight this because I remember that one of our questions was talking about their involvement in the movement. I'm going to go back to this middle paragraph that he was always. So I'm actually going to highlight he was always a strong believer of civil rights, and I'm going to highlight that definition too, which is the movement of whites and African Americans should be equal treatment. He believed in nonviolent demonstrations. He didn't think you should have to hurt people to get what you want. And I'm also going to highlight what he did. Well, it tells us he gave speeches urging people to change segregation laws. And he was even a part of the Montgomery bus boycott. Okay. Now I'm going to come over here and we're going to read about Ruby Bridges. I'm actually going to use a different color highlighter completely. Alright, so Ruby Bridges. Ruby Bridges was born during a time of segregation. So again, I'm going to highlight that. This was a time where things were separated for whites and African Americans. She went to a segregated school until she was 6. At 6, she went into the integration program. This program was to break the segregation barrier in school. This program was created after the court case stating that segregation was not equal. Ruby was met with violence when she tried to attend William Franz Elementary School, a previously all-white school. Ruby's family knew they couldn't react with violence because it would only make it worse. Because of the integration program, Ruby became a symbol of the civil rights movement. So, again, I'm going to highlight this bottom part. Because of the integration program, Ruby became a symbol of the civil rights movement. I'm going to highlight that. I'm also going to come back up and look at these middle two paragraphs. At 6, she went into the integration program, and that program was to break the segregation barrier in school, and it was created after the court case stating that segregation was not equal. And then I'm going to come down to the next paragraph. Ruby was met with violence when she tried to attend William Franz Elementary School, a previously all-white school. Okay? So, going back down to my questions. Number 1, what is similar about when Martin Luther King Jr. and Ruby Bridges was born? So let's go back up. So, looking at what we've highlighted, what do you think was similar? Well, what was similar was that they were both born during a time of segregation. So, coming down here, to write both. Martin Luther King Jr. and Ruby Bridges were born during a time of segregation. Alright, so let's look at number 2. Was Martin Luther King Jr. and Ruby Bridges' involvement in the civil rights movement the same or different? Well, going back up to our passages and looking at what I've highlighted, their involvement, I'm going to say, was different. Because Martin, it tells us, gave speeches, while Ruby gave her contributions by attending a previously all-white school. So I'm going to say their involvement in the civil rights movement was different. Martin Luther King Jr. gave speeches. And what did he give speeches about? He gave speeches about changing the segregation laws, about changing the law, while Ruby Bridges attended a previously all-white school. Alright, so number 3. Did people react similarly with Martin Luther King Jr.'s and Ruby Bridges' involvement in the civil rights movement? Well, let's go back up. So we know that Martin will always be remembered for the major role, and that Ruby became a symbol. So I would say that, yes, people did react similarly. Yes, people did react similarly to their involvement in the civil rights movement. Okay? So, today, your assignment in your Google Classroom is going to be called Inner and Outer Planets. And what you are going to have to do on this assignment, and a couple of them have already been done for you, like kind of as an example. Okay? So what you're going to do is you're going to read the passage, and then you are going to compare the inner planets and the outer planets, and the directions are going to say to use the statements that are hidden around the room. I've actually placed those statements on a slide, on the last slide, so you can kind of use those to help you. Okay? So once you finish that up, I hope you have a great rest of your day.